I just finished cutting off all of the excess edges. As you can see on like these, they're more smooth, and you can see where I cut. So I did that on all of the centers and the edges. Now on the centerpiece, I recommend doing this before you create the centerpiece, because I had a really hard time cutting it off, and some of them I had to sand, but you can see I was able to cut off some of them. And the rest of them I'm just going to leave, because I know I'm just going to cover it up with duct tape later so that I can make sure that it doesn't catch. But I definitely recommend cutting these off before you create and put together the centerpiece. But now we're going to need the extra pieces that you should have saved. So you can see I have all my excess pieces. What we're going to do is we're going to fill in the inside of this to create it more sturdier, so that if it collapses, it still is intact a little bit. So that's what we're going to do now. So what I first did was I looked through my scrap file to see if I had any big pieces that I could possibly use. Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be getting 3x3 squares, and then we're going to be gluing it on to each thing after we fill it up, so that the extra excess stuff cannot come out. So now that I have all my square cuts out, first what I want to do is I want to find the really long one that we first made, and I put one at the bottom of it because we don't have to put the stuff in first. So we can put it in through this hole, and that's what we're going to do right now. So after you have the big one full, you can glue on the top piece, and that makes it so that it's more compact, which will help it from crushing. So now after you did that, you should be able to notice that the core is a whole lot heavier. And so now each edge should be pretty flat, and so that's a good thing. So now what we need to do is we're going to go to the edges, and we're going to cut off the corners so that we can begin to create the actual edge. So I know that I need a lot of room for the corners and the pieces and the internal stuff. So I'm thinking that because this is 8 inches, that I don't want to cut it at 50%, because that would be way too big. So I'm thinking more of setting, instead of 4 inches, thinking like 5 inches. So I would do more like 65-70%. So if yours is like, I don't know, 10-inch QB, then you may want to do somewhere around 7 inches or something like that. So I'm leaving myself around 3 inches of room. So yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark right here where 5 is. I'm going to mark right here, and I'm going to go over here and mark it, and then I'm going to cut along those 2 dots and basically cut off that. After you do that, you want to make sure that it's level after you cut it, so you can do that by placing it down like that and look on both sides. And so you can see I have the edge cut out. So what we're eventually going to do is border this and make this flat, and then we're going to extend that to create the edge. Now you need to do this with the rest of the edges. As you can see, I cut off the corner, so this is what it looks like. So now you can actually use this piece on every other edge to mark and cut off. Now when you do this, you also want to make sure that you're going a little bit to the left, because otherwise it's just going to get too big, and it's going to become from 5 inches to 4.5 by the time you get to the end. So make sure when you draw the line, just to scoot the triangle back a little bit. So now after I cut out all of the pieces for my edges, I glued them on so you can see that they're put on. But if you're going to end up putting stuff inside of it, like you think it's going to be sturdy enough, you have to cut the flap before. So I had to cut all the flaps and then put these on, and so that's what I did right now, and it's pretty sturdy. Whoops, I can fix that. Yeah, it's pretty sturdy. So yeah, and then after that, we're going to be doing the center. So what you do is you take the pieces, and you're going to end up cutting a circle right here on this, so that eventually it'll go on the core like so, and then that way it'll be able to spin. But before we are able to attach it to the core, we're going to have to get some duct tape and put it along these sides so that it's smooth. Otherwise it'll be really hard to spin. So I'm going to have to go get some duct tape, and so that will probably be a couple days before I get that. So right now I'm going to finish cutting the center pieces, fix some gluing on some of them, and then I'm going to probably work on the corners maybe. Now that I finished gluing and cutting, instead of doing the edges, I'm actually going to go to these, and I'm going to cut off any of the excess parts, which I don't have any on this one. Let's see if I can get a good one. So we're gonna cut off these excess pieces so that it doesn't catch in the future. So that's what I'm gonna do right now. So now I finished cutting off all of the excess pieces of that. So now what I'm thinking I'm gonna do is take the corners, and we're actually gonna have to take those two boxes that I have, and we're gonna be doing the same thing that we did with the corners at the very beginning when we were first making them, and we're basically gonna make 8 more corners to put on the other side, but instead of making the tip like this, we're gonna end up cutting it off so that it's that's basically gonna fit like that. It's gonna be flat with all the edges. So if you don't understand that, you will, I'll show it. But first what you're gonna do is you're gonna basically make 8 more corners exactly like these. But do not glue them or tape them. But for this, we're actually going to end up cutting off one of the edges, or the pieces like we did the edges, because it's just unnecessary. So we can cut off one of these so you can figure out which one works the best. So now I'm going to go and cut the rest of them out, and I'm going to cut one of the pieces out, and then we're going to work on cutting out this part. So in order to figure out what we're going to have to cut off right here, we're going to have to measure what this distance is, and so that's how we're going to figure it out. So we have to measure this, and when I measure it, I measured it, I got 4.5 inches for each edge. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create a square that is 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches, so that we can literally just lay it on there and then cut it based off of that dimension. So what we can do is use this leftover piece that we have, cut a square, and we can use that one square for the entire project. So that is what we will be doing. So I'm going to cut this down to 4.5 by 4.5 inches. So now I've cut the small square. So what you want to do is you're going to line it up for each corner to match where it is, and then what we're going to do is just cut out that, and then when we fold it up, it should be the same size. So now what we're going to do is, now that this is laid down, we're going to cut it like this, but of course as close as possible to the square. And so that's what I'm going to do now. We've done that. As you can see, we're left with this piece. So what we can do is, you can see that when we put this together, it's like the end of the triangle. So what we can actually use this for is at the very end of the project, we can use it to help support, because the end piece is going to actually look like this on the end of the corner. It's just going to be bigger. So we can use this for support later. So you can just throw this in the scrap pile. And so yeah, so you can see that when we put our corner together, it's like that. And if we have an edge next to it, you can see that they're basically the same size, or they are the same size. So that's really good. So basically what we got to do is we got to make a bunch of these and then glue them together, and then we're going to put them on the other corners. So that's what I'm going to do now, and I'll get back to you when I'm done cutting all of those and cutting that part off. So now I've cut all of the corner pieces, and I know that I want to do the same thing with the edges with the corners, where I can open them up. So I'm also going to have to cut those corners before I put these pieces on, but I can at least still make these so that they can go into a pile and stuff. But I can put some duct tape on after I put it together, but I still have to cut the flaps on there like I did the edges. So that's what I'm going to do after I finish creating these. And if you don't know, duct tape is around 2 inches wide. So I made it so that each flap is around 1 1/4 inches away, because when I put it on the edges, you gotta take into account that it'll be half of it, and I don't want it to cover it, but I also want it to be as big as a flap as possible. So that's how I figured out how the dimensions were for my flaps. So each one is roughly 1.5 inches away from the edge. And I'm going to do the same thing for the corners together. So now what I have to do is I'm going to end up cutting the flap for the corners. And so that's what I'm going to do. Make sure you don't do it on the side that should be doubled up if you doubled up one of the sides like I did. So make sure to do it when you're making the flaps, if you're going to do that, on one of the sides where it's not doubled up. That way that side stays really thick and it's not super hard to get out the flap. And it makes life basically just easier. So go ahead and you can cut the flaps, or you can not cut the flaps and just do what happens next, which is where I'm pretty sure we're going to cut out the triangles for the corners. So I've now cut out the flaps, and I realized that I'm going to do the same thing with the corners as the edges, where instead of putting the piece right there and extending it out, I'm going to leave that for the very last part of putting the corners and edges together. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these together with the corners so that I have a full corner, because I've now cut out all the flaps. I put all of the corners together and they look really good, but now I'm going to end up cutting off all of this excess that you can see. I have some right there on all of the pieces, so that's what I'm going to do now. And I'll get back when I'm done cutting off all of the excess stuff. So this is what it looks like now with all of the pieces kind of together. And you can see I have the centerpiece around the core right there. And so when you do this, if you have the core inside of it, the core, because you made the circles, should be able to help support it. And as you can see, I have it to where it's only coming out 3 inches on this side. And if I was able to zoom in underneath what it would look like, see, I can look through this edge. You can see what the inside looks like right now. Let's see if I can get a light on. No, I can't get a light on. But I can take some pictures that'll put the flash on. So now that I have the whole thing together, I'm thinking instead of working on the actual pieces, I'm going to do the centers first, because I think that it'll be a whole lot easier to create the pieces after I've finished making the centers. So I wanted to be able to make it so that I could take this thing apart and put it back together pretty easily. So I had to come up with a way like the regular Rubik's Cube so that I could access the center and still be able to undo it. So as you can see, I have this thing and then the circle around it. So all this is allowing is that it can spin this way. But when it's together, I can push the centerpiece back and forward as far as I want. So when I originally measured this, I made it so that this was 3 inches from here to there. So what I did was, in order to make it so that I could be able to take it apart, but at the same time it would cause it not to be able to move, what I'm gonna do is I ended up making these squares that are gonna act like a screw or a spring or whatever you want to call it, and it's gonna go on it like that. And then what's gonna happen is that's gonna restrict this going this direction, so it can't go this way anymore if this is here. But at the same time, it can still go back the other direction. So then what's going to happen is I'm going to put a thing on top of this. So basically I'm going to end up making a whole nother centerpiece that's just a tiny bit smaller that I can slide in right here like a regular centerpiece on Rubik's Cube. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a bunch of squares that are like this long and then glue it to this piece. And then I can open it so I can take this centerpiece off so that I have this accessed, and then I can take this off, which will allow me to take it apart. So here, this is how I figured out the dimensions for this. So I knew that I originally made this 3 inches by 3 inches, so I knew these had to be bigger than 3 inches by 3 inches. But I also had to take in a point that this would need to be, it would need to be big enough, but not too big, so that it would go into it. But because I wanted to restrict this movement as much as possible. So what I did was I made it 3 1/4 by 3 1/4, and then when I put them on top of it to try to make it a tiny bit smaller, and then I'm eventually going to end up cutting off the excess pieces so that it looks nicer. But so that it'll end up going like that. So as you see, I made 4, so you can see what I did to create them, as I have 2 left. So I made a square that was 3 1/4 by 3 1/4. And then because it was 3 inches in, I made a bunch that were 3 1/4 by 3 inches, so that it can go up against the wall and be level with that. So what's going to happen is I'm going to glue these on like so, and then that'll create the boxes. So that's how I did that. So this is kind of acting like a washer in a way, and then the centerpiece. So this and the centerpiece are what's going to help restrict the movement of the centerpiece going this way. Or as you can see on the top, the centerpiece, when you try to put it on top, like so, it just falls straight down. So that's going to potentially fix that issue. So now I'm going to finish these two, and that's how the core is going to work. So after I finish this, then I'm going to work on extending them so that it's level with the centerpieces. So I know that the centerpieces are 5 inches this way, and I know if these are 3 inches, I have to add 2 inches of thickness this way, but I'm actually only going to add a little bit less just because there's going to be another thing that goes right here. So after I do make all of these, extend it by like 1 inch and 14/16 or something like that, then I'm gonna create the pieces that are gonna go on top of that, and then I essentially have the core done. So all I have left is to do the outer pieces of the corners and edges, which will take a very long time. But I'll have to get the dimensions for all of it, and then once I make 1 or 2, it should be pretty easy. So that's what I'm going to be doing now.